Every lore video on Rapture frames Apollo Square as an inevitable compromise, but this misses its true purpose. From the bathysphere's descent, you see grandeur than the jagged teeth of tenements below. Andrew Ryan's Utopia didn't just house the destitute. From the lore, its video on spatial design was of frames blade Apollo sathospheres bathyspheres, slow and silent. Purpose tenements below angled to what if the funnel walls whispers into themselves were silence engineered to crush defiance. Architecture can be its first weapon. Andrew Ryan's Utopia didn't just house the destitute. The towers of Apollo Square rose like caged monoliths, their concrete ribs angled to funnel whispers into silence. Narrow corridors bled into dead-end alcoves, each turn a reminder, escape was a myth. Damp clung to the walls, a cold sweat that mirrored the weight of ceilings, sagging low enough to bow the spine. Here the poor walked in measured steps, their shadows swallowed by the dark between floodlights. Ryan's manifesto spoke of self-made men, yet these halls bred obedience. Every stairwell was a bottleneck, every window a slit for surveillance. The poor didn't just live here, they were contained. A city's promise of freedom requires boundaries, after all. Who draws them, and who decides which dreams are permitted to breathe? Andrew Ryan's vision of Rapture as a self-sustaining utopia required more than ideology. Bill McDonough, his pragmatic collaborator, translated objectivism into concrete. Apollo Square's tenements were not mere shelters. Their narrow corridors, low ceilings, and labyrinthine compressed not just space but possibility. A man cannot think freely in a room that feels like a cage. Ryan preached self-reliance. McDonough built dependence. The tenement's shared walls carried whispers of need, neighbors' hunger, children's coughs, the grind of poverty. These sounds were not accidental. They were a chorus of restraint, a reminder here survival was a transaction. Every cracked window, every damp stair demanded coin. The wealthy in their spire towers could ignore the hum beneath them, but the hum was deliberate. What does a city built on freedom fear? Its own fragility. Apollo Square's design did not kill dissent, it starved it before it could rise. A man broken by cold and debt is less likely to question the system that froze him. Ryan's utopia required obedience, cloaked as choice. McDonough's architecture was the cloak. The tenements stood as silent enforcers, no soldier needed, no law, just walls that whispered asterisk you are small here asterisk, and in that smallness what dreams could take root. Above Apollo Square, Rapture's spires pierced the ocean's gloom. Atom glow fueled a vertical kingdom, wealth pooled in crystalline towers, while below, the poor walled themselves into shadows. The district's geometry was not accident, corridors narrowed not just space but sightlines. A glance upward revealed only slivers of sky, a reminder, the summit belongs to others. Streets curved inward, stifling the spread of thought. No plazas, no squares, only dead ends where whispers dissolved. Here the little sisters were harvested, their essence siphoned by big data's guardians and prisoners, both. Their labor built Rapture's wealth, yet their own world was a cage of concrete and salt. The architects called it efficiency. A system where need was met with rations, not revolt, but efficiency has a cost. The poor did not just live in Apollo Square, they were shaped by it. Hope in such a place is a fragile thing, it bends, it breaks. And when the underclass ceased to dream, what power could they challenge? The question lingers, did the designers know that to crush rebellion you need not chains, only walls that whisper, asterisk you are small here asterisk. The walls whispered, for 20 years they murmured. Then in 1958 the silence cracked. Atlas Revolt did not begin with fire. It began with a recognition. Apollo Square's corridors were not just narrow, they were a cage with no exit. The splicers moved through those halls like shadows, their rage a virus in the veins of Rapture's underbelly. What architecture could not suffocate, the war unraveled. Tenements that once bent residents into silence now amplified the screams of the broken. The district's designate suffocating scale, its deliberate anonymity had not prevented rebellion, it had gestated it. The Civil War's first week saw Apollo Square stairwells become battlegrounds, its dead-end alleys transformed into traps. The wealthy above never understood, their order was a wound dressed in stone. When the splicers tore through it, the infection spread. The revolt's violence was not chaos. It was the building's final lesson, delivered in shrapnel and blood. The architects had not intended this, but the walls, hollow and hungry, had remembered every whisper. The streets of Apollo Square curve like clenched fingers, narrowing until escape becomes a phantom. Windows face inward, blind to the sea. Alleys fold into dead ends, their bricks swallowing light. No open sky, no horizon, only concrete weight pressing until breath feels like a luxury. The poor walk these halls as if already buried. What does a city achieve when its geometry forgets the shape of freedom? The tenements of Apollo Square did not merely shelter the destitute, they caged them. Narrow corridors funneled hope into dead ends. Stairwells spiraled like coiled serpents, each step a surrender. Fontaines smuggled goods, contraband, salt, black market seeds carved cracks in Ryan's autarky. A city meant to float above morality now bled through its seams. Workers bartered with shadows, their loyalty eroded by whispers of a world beyond Rapture's glass. The little sisters, those hollow-eyed husks, became a currency of shame. Their harvested dreams, Ryan's relics of the soul, were not trophies but indictments. The working class watched their daughters become commodities, their grief a silent riot. Apollo Square's architects knew no door could hold a revolution, so they built no doors worth breaking. The poor moved through labyrinths that devoured their own paths. A child lost in those halls would not scream. Silence was the only survival. Fontaine's networks and Ryan's ethics both collapsed like the false walls they were. What remains when a city's bones are picked clean by the very systems meant to sustain it? The square's final breath was not a scream but a sigh. A million lives compressed into a geometry of despair. Rapture's fall was not sudden. It was the sound of 1,000 locked doors, each one opened by the weight of what lay behind them. The walls of Apollo Square still breathe. They exhale the dust of 1,000 lives pressed thin. A labyrinth of soot-stacked bricks, its corridors narrow enough to make shoulders ache each turn, a reminder. Here the poor were not housed, they were herded. No windows face outward. Light is a currency rationed to the elite. What little filters down fractures into jagged shards, slicing through the soot-choked air like judgment. The stairwells spiral in on themselves, their iron steps worn to bone white by desperate feet. To ascend is to claw at the same stone over and over. The architects knew. They carved these walls with a surgeon's certainty, not to shelter but to subjugate. Dead-end alleys where whispers dissolve. Courtyards walled on all sides, their silence louder than any guard's boot. A child could map the system, every shortcut blocked, every vista narrowed to a slit. The people's eyes were to stay low, their rage to fester in the dark. What does a city sound like when it crushes its own? The answer hums in Apollo Square's hollow veins. The tenements are not ruins. They are relics of a war fought without guns, a war where the battlefield was the body and the weapon was space itself. Did the designers dream of this stillness? A district so broken it forgets how to rise. They did not dream. Andrew Ryan's towers carved a sky of limits. Bill McDonough's blueprints etched obedience into brick. Frank Fontaine's tunnels funneled fear like water. Sophia Lamb's whispers taught children to crave chains. Apollo Square was no accident. Its corridors narrowed like a throat, its stairwells bent the spine. A man could not see the sea, a child could not touch the ceiling. Ryan called it order, Lamb called it family, both called it progress. But the walls were not just barriers, they were a language, a dialect of deprivation. Every cracked window framed a reminder, you are small. Every dead-end street repeated, you are alone. The Rapture family's hands clasped in public squares, their minds splintered by private hunger. Objectivism's creed of self-reliance crumbled in the damp. The architects knew a district that never saw the surface would never yearn to rise. The poor walked in circles, the rich walked in straight lines. The distance between was a lesson. Apollo Square was the silence before the scream, and the scream it was never meant to escape. The buildings lined like sentinels, streets funneled hope into a trickle, dead ends became metaphors. Apollo Square's silence was not absence, it was a presence, a weight pressing down on every breath. The air hung thick with unspoken pleas. Children's laughter never rose above a whisper, even the rats avoided the central thoroughfare. Minerva's den holds a mirror to this. The thinker's corruption, its code unraveling into statistics, shows the slow decay of a district designed to suffocate. Both systems, human and machine, were meant to govern. Both failed by overreaching. The den's computer sought to calculate order. Apollo Square's planners built it into the walls. Aristotle's dictum, give the people a roof, take their sky. The tenement's narrow windows framed only grime, no horizon. Stairwells spiraled without rhythm, disorienting. The poor did not just live there, they were buried alive, layer by layer. Yet the greatest cruelty was the illusion of community. Shared suffering became a bond, a cage with no bars. The thinker's final scream was digital. Apollo Squares was human, swallowed by stone. What does a city sound like when its voice is walls, when the architecture itself is the jailer? Control is not maintained by strength alone. It requires a silence so deep, even the victims forget they are screaming. The stones of Rapture remember. Andrew Ryan's objectivism promised liberation, yet Apollo Square's concrete arteries funneled hope into dust. Narrow corridors stifled both air and ambition. Tenements pressed inward, not outward, toward survival, not progress. Each window framed not the sea, but the unyielding bulk of neighborly despair. The district's monoliths did not shelter, they suffocated. A child's first steps were measured in the weight of walls. A widow's final breath met no horizontally the cold calculus of adjacent bricks. Ryan's dream of self-sustaining utopia crumbled into a geometry of obedience. No guards patrolled Apollo Square, no chains bound its residents. Yet the layout itself dictated their lives, where to turn, where to kneel, where to vanish. The architecture did not merely house the destitute. It erased their capacity to demand more. Every cracked stairwell whispered a lesson. Your limits are not yours, they are etched. The illusion of autonomy was the final weapon. To walk these streets was to accept the cage as destiny. To call it home was to forget the scream. Control need not be seen to be obeyed. It need only be lived. Apollo Square stands as testament not to ideology's triumph, but its tomb. The stones do not lie, they never have. Beyond Apollo Square's broken walls, the prison of Persephone sharpens the blade. Sophia Lamb's vision did not end in crumbling tenements. There, stone becomes a psychological chain, no bars. No guards, only corridors that bend the mind, rooms that whisper obedience. The destitute were shaped here, the willful were unmade. What does a prison look like when its purpose is not to hold but to erase?